just so they are all aware, conference is being recorded. It will be available on the Doug website afterwards. The only exception is the segment from the National Statistician, Ian Diamonds, who's requested that his presentation isn't recorded, but I'm sure that you'll appreciate that will probably enable him to answer questions somewhat more freely than if it was recorded. So we're really grateful to have him around. So that's my I think that's all the housekeeping rules. I can now stop and just check Jan's nodding, which in the normal conference I don't get the opportunity to do. I've got a thumbs up as well. So we've covered all the housekeeping rules. I will minimize that element and the other one, yeah. And now I've just got the program ahead. And next we've got my short introduction. So I think I can just share the screen for a moment. So yeah, let me, here we go, share my PowerPoint. I will start the presentation. And as you know, the overall theme for the conference is data analysis in a crisis for very obvious reasons. We're all sat within a crisis and of COVID proportions. And we've all had a whole bunch of very new things to do, and as we all know, data analysis normally has to work with history and certainly has to develop itself based on substantial, often, amounts of data. But of course, in very new circumstances, we don't have that, and we have to become somewhat available. And this is where and why I've chosen the title of my talk, If Data Analysis is Art, Where's the Flair? And it comes really because of reading a number of books recently, and also this idea that we've got suddenly faced with no data or very little data, and we have to be creative about the way we use it. And that's driven by analysis, but also a number of books called The Art of, and the one in particular which I heartily recommend is the new book called The Art of Statistics by David Spiegelhalter, who's been the Winstonian Professor of the Public Understanding of Risk, based in Cambridge, not far away from me. But he's managed actually to get into some of the sort of more mainstream channels, and he's certainly been called upon quite a lot about to comment on statistics in the media recently, and is a common contributor to one of the radio programs you won't be surprised and I'll really like to listen to, which is called More or Less on Radio 4, again examining statistics in the current domain. But it struck me what makes it an art, and if we look at most of the books, if I move myself on, most of the books that take this notice think of a toolkit and an art. Think of it as an art, because what we've got together is a toolkit. Whenever we're doing an analytics, be it statistics or data science as well, where you've seen being talked about, we come to a problem with a whole variety of things at our disposal, and we as ourselves have to put those together into a format which we think is going to address the problem at hand. And what's quite interesting for me is they contrast it with it being a science, but then they present science as if it's some form of recipe or algorithm or a fixed way of doing things, which might be computer science or even contended there, but even there, I think science itself is very rarely a recipe, and we've seen the government itself trying to follow science and finding out that science no longer gives you a definitive path. But anyway, I think science itself is also part of the toolkit, and certainly the ancient Greeks would never have seen something like an inductive process with experimentation, finding things which are provisional and which get attacked and brought down by the next experiment as anything like fixed and universal. They would definitely have put science alongside the arts, and and alongside a trade or a craft, and I'll move on into what occurs to me is that when you've got a toolkit, that toolkit can actually refer to someone doing a trade, someone doing a craft, or for that matter, the artist. And I particularly want to reflect a bit on when would we actually use our toolkit to be conducting a trade, when would we be doing a craft or an art. And I remember not long after we moved to near Cambridge, bought a house, and we started wanting to do some repairs and renovation of the house, and we lived across the road from a plasterer, and I particularly picked the picture of someone doing plastering, because whilst trades, I don't want to be at all demeaning about being a trade. Trades are themselves a really important and valued profession. I don't want to, but because I remember watching one particular day the neighbour from across the road being a plasterer for decades, and watching him just apply it to the wall, mesmerised at the craft, the skill that was entailed, and the way that he manipulated that stuff on the wall, and the blessed thing didn't drop off and ended up incredibly smooth. I was also, and I remember that moment still now, being quite awestruck about the trade. But the thing about the trade, I think, when you think about it, is that the trade is functional. It's there to address an issue and make sure it works. Similarly with, you might think of electricians, for example, a whole bunch of trades, carpentry, maybe another one, where you want to make sure the table stands up and does a job, and that and is useful afterwards. And that's, for me, what a trade is, even though it takes a toolkit, if you like. And it's, you hope, reproducible, and it's something you agree at the outset to deliver, and you end up saying that the job's being done well because it's a job that's output and delivered the results at the end that you had at the beginning. The second is a craft, if you like, and a craft, I would say, is also something that you know what you're going to plan for at the end, but you're leaving space for that craft to have a certain sense of individuality, or a certain sense of beauty, you might call it, something that is there that can not only function, but also in one way or another make your life more enjoyable, shall we say, rather than just being functional. And you can, you will all have your own examples of where someone had their tools of the trade, in this instance, the pottery that you look at, and then you can begin to see something coming to life and having some sense of expression on it. But again, somewhat repeatable. You might set it out and have a series of patterns that you want to introduce, but there is usually in a craft, you would imagine, a significant level of skill, and in a decorative sense, put there for no other purpose than it looks. I'm gonna use the word pretty, but I don't really like it. But and sometimes it demonstrates some decadence in that it's a craft that is projecting the power, say, of the monarchy, for example. And then lastly, in this tripartite, you've got the artist, and the artist, I think, is there for a one-off. And when you commission an artist, you don't actually know what you're going to get at the end of it, and that artist is going through a process where they're working with a variety of different media and trying to actually communicate something with that different media and come up with something that is unique, novel, and not been around before, and probably never will be reproduced again, even by that artist themselves. And also within it has a certain amount of style about themselves and what they're doing. And I just want to move on to Leo Tolstoy, because one of the very well-known artists. He was predominantly a writer and a philosopher, but what I loved about his expression was he talked about how art, in whatever way it is looking to represent the feelings or the experience that the particular artist has had, and in one way or another, the way they've lived through it, try and convey it so that somebody else has that lived through experience. I love the word that they're infected, as the quote has, by those feelings that artist conveyed, and also enables them in one way or another to experience them. And that's the really fascinating element of art, in that it becomes a very personal thing. There's a whole range of different tools that you might use, and in doing that, you then try to encourage and enable other people to experience what's within that artist. And this is where I want to make the analogy with data analysts in particular, in that actually we are in a position where we aren't asked to convey what's our own feeling and experience, and this is perhaps where we differ from art as a function itself, but we are asked to convey the things that we see underneath and the things that we find within the data. And in one way or another, partly people want us to lose our own identity so that we're conveying what's going on within the data, but we have to do that with tools that actually are done in a way that's distinctive. And so that leads me then to controversially perhaps make a slightly different order to the way things currently get presented. And I want to argue that whilst data science in the current climate it gets a somewhat elevated expression, I don't like the word science in this particular application, but we'll run with it. What I want to suggest is, in the tripartite of data science, statistics, and analysis, it's data science that's the trade, and I'll tell you why I think that. Firstly, because data science nearly always is focused on trying to create things that are highly repetitive and usually highly functional, and I would argue that it's often why, when you talk to data scientists, they think that prediction is, and the mismatch matrix, if you like, is almost the only thing that's required to be output. And if you've got, as long as you've got the data right, and that's a whole different story, if you can show that you've got the best prediction, that there's no need to understand what's going on underneath. So they'll project that and see that there's very little benefit. So for me, they're very much about producing a functional report. That's my link with the trade. I'm not saying there's no skill in it, but I am saying that they're interested in repeatability and fixed prediction. You then get to statistics, if you like, and that's where we're moving into an area where we're trying to develop understanding as well as prediction, possibly understanding what things are happening. But most statistical methods require us to have a particular framework in which we work. And I relate back when I was first moving from physics into more general statistics. I was at a conference in Barcelona. The plenary speaker was a hero of mine called George Box. His autobiography is called The Accidental Statistician. And the reason for the talk was it began with this phrase that maths is a great servant and a terrible master. And he bemoaned the fact that most people trained in statistics had their creativity squeezed out of them, and that whilst statisticians their focus was on uncertainty, all we ever did was actually get rid of uncertainty, because we were only ever trialing hypotheses. We were never part of the process of creating the hypotheses in the first place, which for me was a great inspiration to actually continue being involved in statistics, because I'd always kept away from things like the pharmaceuticals, where the actual approach was dictated by regulation. And so I want to move on then from statistics, which requires if you like, a well-founded basis on which to develop, to what I think is, if you like, the high art, and I'm going to argue, of data analysis. Because the reason that I call this the most artistic of these professions is because we have a role to play in which requires a whole feast of judgment. We have often a situation where there's gaps in the data, where there's data that's observational, so that we can't roll back to statistics and say we've done a randomized control trial. We want to make sure we're making judgments even when the data isn't helpful, even when it's not framed in the right way, even when, as we've had in the last few months, to a large extent, it doesn't exist. So we're asked to use our judgment, to use our ability, to use our individuality to actually demonstrate and come to some helpful pointers. And I would argue that sometimes there's a point where, because it's required, we don't follow the science, but we sometimes have to lead the science. We sometimes have to create the hypotheses which may later on get knocked down. That's what's vulnerable about that place. But it does enable people to make some further decisions and move on. And I'll give an illustration really in one of the areas which I think is really important, and that we talk about in terms of causal inference, where for example, if we want to know a cause and as a result from that cause enable a commercial budget holder, for example, to know where to put their money, just knowing what the projected output from the data science just doesn't answer the question. It doesn't give you the ability to know what levers to move. In a statistical point of view, there are lots of regression and areas are like what we've just had with the vaccine announcement yesterday, only really work if you've really been able to structure the design of the experiment and create some form of randomized control trial. Incidentally, I don't know if you noticed, but the hoo-ha yesterday about the vaccine is still at the moment only based on 94 people having caught COVID in samples of 44,000 people. I'll allow you to go and decide whether you think that's yet got to the point where Rolls-Royce and the like have massive changes of value on the stock exchange. But that's another thing. But then the reason I go back to causal inference and move into analysis is, if you followed, like myself, the work of graphs and of Drye Pearl and the like, what you begin to look at if you've got observational data is the ability to understand and identify causal behavior in observational data, no longer in the remote randomized control trials. It's the stuff that's available, but you have to make your judgment on what you think may be the underlying behavior. You can't just rely on the data to answer the questions. You have to engage in a variety of different ways. And so, to follow the artistic analogy, sometimes you might have a photorealistic type of thing where you've got huge amounts of tiny amounts of data which don't really change things. You might call that the data science style. You've also got what you might call block type paintings, which fill in large chunks with single types of colors, which is synonymous with the way in which you might use cluster analysis, for example, or when we try and segregate data into bulk. But actually, what I really like, and particularly like in the data analysis field, is where you have to be somewhat minimalist. You have to look at certain areas with a great amount of detail. Other areas are left quite blank, and with only impressionistic lines to join them together. But still, we have to convey honestly and truthfully, and if you like, congruently, what is the way in which the data is behaving. So I want us as data analysts to see ourselves, if you like, as the top of the pile inside the way in which analysis is spread. That we are the elites because we have to take account of all the different methodologies and techniques and the missing data and the using the raw materials that are presented to us to answer the questions, rather than necessarily being, I think, somewhat dismissed at the moment by people who, for example, just think AI is the local pixie dust, and we'll solve any problem. So as I've said many times, I think Doug is about promoting and recognizing the value of us as humans in that process of engaging with data. And as I say, that for me is part of that process of us being artistic and want us to hold our heads high, and as a result speak truth to power sometimes when they don't really want it. And that's one of the great things that artists can do, is they can sometimes say inconvenient things in unusual ways that shock and gain attention. And I want us to sometimes see ourselves as analysts in that role as well. So hopefully that's fired us up with a sense of anticipation for what the rest of the people are going to present during the conference, and I look forward to it